So I'm Michael Knock, Dean of the Goldman School, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this special dinner to complete a fantastic day celebrating the life and works and influence of Tom Schelling. First things first, election returns. There's a rumor of an election, and the rumor about the rumor is CNN has declared McCain has won the nomination, and Huckabee has withdrawn. Let's hear a big round of applause for CNN declares that Hillary Clinton has won Rhode Island, and she's ahead in Rhode Island roughly 60-40. CNN has declared that Obama has won Vermont, and he's ahead 60-39. In Ohio, too close to call. Clinton is ahead, though, with 47% of the vote, 56-42 in Ohio. In Texas, too close to call. With 20% of the vote counted, this is in the primaries before the caucuses, Clinton 49, Obama 49. Okay. Should we continue with the program or just quit? Okay. Enough of the political stuff. So let me just take a minute to thank you all for coming. And for those of you who were able to attend the session today, 7.5 hours of nonstop Schelling stuff. It was a great treat for all of us. We had 4 panels chaired by our committee. Bob Powell led off the first session on Schelling and international relations. There was a second panel led by Rich Gilbert of the economics department on Schelling strategy and industrial organizations. I led a third panel on strategy, Schelling, and scary stuff. And there was a fourth panel that Rob McCoon led on micro motives and macro behavior. We had among us, among the panelists, 3 Nobel laureates, in addition to Tom. Dan McFadden, who is here. George Akerlof, who I think is here somewhere. Maybe is George not here? Maybe not here. And Ken Arrow, who is, I still think, here. And we're going to hear from a 5th Nobel laureate in just a few minutes. I want to thank our committee and John Quigley, the chair of it, for putting together this fantastic program. I'm going to turn it over to John to introduce our speaker, but before I do, I want to share with you one Tom Schelling story, which some of you might have heard if you are members of the school's Board of Advisors, but for the rest of you, you would probably not have heard of this. Around 1990, I was dean of a graduate school of public policy at the University of Maryland. And after certain developments, it became clear that Tom Schelling could be recruited to Maryland. I was quite ecstatic. I was able to convince my colleagues in the economics department, led by Malin Strassheim, who was the chair, and Mansur Olson, who I believe was a student of Tom's. And we assembled a joint appointment for Tom at Maryland in economics and public policy. Everything went through, everything seemed fine. And then at the 11th hour, I got a call from the provost, said, Michael, we have a problem. What's the problem? Problem is, Michael, that this is a state university, and we require, by order of the legislature, 3 letters of recommendation in the file, and you never even ask for letters. I said, it's Tom Schelling. What do you mean? I don't need letters. They said, we don't care if it's Jesus Christ, you need letters. So with a tremendous amount of timidity, every part of me was shaking. I called Tom and said, Tom, we have a minor problem. We need 3 letters of recommendation. Can you suggest a few people? Deadly silence on the other end of the phone. I figured this was it. This was the deal breaker. This was the end of everything. And then Tom said, would it be okay if they were all Nobel laureates? I said, I think that would be okay. So now, you know, academic personnel issues are hyper secret, so I'll only tell this once. There were three letters. The first was from a Nobel laureate from Yale University. I won't mention his name. Fantastic letter. Several pages, off the charts, wonderful. Second letter was from a Nobel laureate from MIT. Fantastic letter, off the charts. The third letter was from someone. It was 2 one-sentence paragraphs. The first paragraph said, "Dean Nacht, I am responding to your letter of so-and-so requesting a letter of recommendation about Tom Schelling." Period. Space. New paragraph. "Tom Schelling is the smartest economist I've ever met. Sincerely, Paul Samuelson." I read that to the provost. I said, "Will this do?" "This will do." And now to introduce our speaker, John Quigley.
Well, it's an honor to introduce Mike Spence this evening. Mike is an illustrious member of the cohort who entered Harvard Economics Department in 1968 and left in 1972. Among other things, that group had the honor of having the first class in economic theory from Ken Arrow, who had recently arrived from the West Coast. Mike finished a thesis which was well received, as they say, and went on from there to a year at the Kennedy School before moving west. Everything loose ends up on the West Coast, except Mike moved back from Stanford to Harvard, where he served first on the faculty, then as chair of the economics department, and finally as dean of Harvard College. As I said, everything loose ends up on the West Coast, and Mike returned to California to Stanford to become dean of the Stanford Business School, and was dean at GSB for about 8 years. He's currently the head, the chairman of the Independent Commission on Growth, which is an organization which is distinct from, but is somehow supported by, in ways we don't fully understand, by the World Bank and the Asia Development Bank and the International Monetary Fund. They're commissioned with producing a document that will provide for the next generation, or at least the next decade, or at least the next 5 years, some insight as to how economic growth can be increased and can be distributed better throughout the world. Michael was honored in 2001 with the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics, which he shared with our colleague George Akerlof and also with Joe Stiglitz. The honor was for his contributions to the economics of asymmetric information. If you read the citation for Mike, it was not only for his contributions to understanding it, but also for showing the circumstances under which asymmetric information is important in economic markets. Now, Mike's examples in his early work was all about investing in education and the signaling value of personal investments in education. But as everyone in this room knows, this is grist for the mill in financial markets, in the signals that are given routinely by firms in their dividend policy in stock markets, and in a whole variety of circumstances, including the ways in which central banks signal their behavior by foreign exchange policy. It's big stuff, it's a big deal, and we're pleased to have Mike here this evening.
Well, I took some notes, so Dean Nacht and Professor Quigley. John and I were in graduate school together. That's why that irreverent introduction. I appreciate it. It's fun to be here. It's great to be part of and I'm sorry I wasn't here all day, but in part of an event to honor Tom's work. And I think when we do that, what pops into all of our minds is creativity and originality, along with a lot of other things, but above everything else. Juliana, my wife, and I had a chance to join Tom and Alice at his Nobel Prize ceremonies in Stockholm. And I remember two things. Oh, first of all, it's a lot more fun to be there as a visitor than it is to be the main event, so to speak. But I remember two feelings at that occasion, or you know, sort of senses. One was just a sense of joy that you get when somebody that you like and respect and are very fond of is recognized in that way. I mean, I don't know how to describe that any better. It's just the way you feel. There's sometimes it just seems right. And the second overwhelming impression was of a nearly uncountable number of happy children and grandchildren roaming around with us at the periphery. It was just really wonderful. It's a little daunting to be in a room with two of your thesis advisors, and kind of scary in a way. The only thing that was like it that I can recall was actually the time that George and Joe and I went to Stockholm, because it was the 200th anniversary of the Nobel Prize. And so they thought this was an important occasion, and they invited everybody back. And pretty much everybody came. I think that's right, Dan. And I had to talk Ken Arrow into it. He wasn't going to come, but Gary Becker took him off to Norway, and he showed up too. And so this lecture that you give at the Nobel Prize ceremony, normally to a distinguished group of Swedish colleagues and graduate students, sort of looked like this when you got up to talk. I mean, the first row was Paul Samuelson, Gary Becker, the late Milton Friedman. It just went on like that. And I literally started to shake, and I thought, I'll never have a chance to be put in a position like that again. You know, I'm going to talk about global warming, but let me make a couple of observations for a minute. A lot of us have learned a great many things from Tom, but I thought I'd share with you what I've learned and continue to learn from him. So I don't think it'll be any surprise to you that those of us who were his students and interacted with him a lot were struck by the fact that his mode of reasoning wasn't orthogonal to the way everybody else thought, but it was certainly different. And it was characterized by the frequent use of analogies. Now, I remember being invited. Tom would often take us to lunch. He's enormously generous with time. And I had some problem that had to do with, those of you who know about signaling and screening, was separating equilibria. And so Tom listened to this rather arid discussion of why I was confused for a while, and then started talking about swimmers and surfers on a beach in Southern California and what they did to sort themselves out and so that they didn't kill each other or whatnot. And my first thought was, this is ridiculous. I mean, I'm with my thesis advisor, and he's talking about, and then it hit me that he was talking about something that was sort of partly similar and partly different and looking for something. And that mode of reasoning is, I would say, characteristic and almost uniquely characteristic of Tom. But I had a thought recently that I hadn't understood, and it goes like this. Many of us build models. And models are terribly powerful things in the social sciences because they force you to sort of decide what's important and what's not and put it in and then make it work all together. And you can't do that with words. You can't see all these simultaneous interactions. But models are also traps in the sense that it's extremely easy to lose sight of what you've left out of the model. Now, much of what you've left out, if it's a good model, should be left out. That's the whole point of, you know, the art of simplification. But sometimes some of the things that are left out are really important. And I think, to some extent, that this other mode of reasoning that Tom used was, in some sense, a way through what we would call case studies or examples of looking for situations that were similar where we could see potentially important variables. Now, if we had longer tonight, I'd give you examples. Most models in the kinds of economies that we live in don't have trust in them, for example. Ken Arrow has talked a lot about trust. There's a lot of economies that I now study, as in the position that John described, where that variable is missing. So it's left out of the models for good reason in a particular application, but not dangerously left out in other models that are supposed to apply to developing countries where the institutional constructs that are required to substitute for the absence of trust in many environments is actually a very expensive and, at times, ineffective proposition. I will say one other thing about development and then turn to my main topic. Bob Solow and I are involved in this commission where we're trying to understand and be helpful on the question of growth. Bob's there because he has relevant knowledge, and I'm there because they made a mistake and forgot what my background was. One of the things that's terribly important in growth is, it won't surprise you very much, is investment, including foreign investment, because it carries with it knowledge transfer. It is the most powerful known knowledge transfer mechanisms. There are others, including, and maybe on an equal par, educating people, very bright people from other countries in places like this great institution. Getting that process started, where there's extreme uncertainty about the investment environment, is a natural place to think about political leaders making commitments that bind themselves by limiting their options so that they can make credible statements about not only the investment environment now, but its duration. That critical idea of sort of self-binding yourself as a part of the process of making commitments, which I'm sure you discussed today in the course of these seminars, has essentially not infected the world of development economics at all. And so when you say there's an element of strategy here that has to do with how it is that your intent with respect to the investment horizons of these people is going to be credible, I think if I were advising a young person who had a theoretical and game theoretic interest and an interest in development, I'd point him in this direction. Having said that, let me say my main subject tonight is a subject that I'm actually trying to write about, and it's a subject that Tom is not only interested in, but one he talks about frequently. It is the relationship between the global warming issue and the developing countries. Tom actually recently gave a very interesting lecture at the World Bank, at the PREM network, at their invitation, and covered an enormous amount of ground. I won't try to cover that today. He said startling, surprising, and sensible things in the course of these 13 pages or hour-long talk, and answered questions. My only justification for venturing into this, other than it seems to be important as a future global trend that developing countries are going to have to deal with, is that I once wrote papers with Mark Roberts and Marty Weitzman on the question of the use of market and other mechanisms to deal with things like environmental problems. And so here's what I want to try to talk about tonight. The developing countries, as you know, have a huge stake in the outcome of this. It's not widely known, but the most vulnerable countries in terms of climate change are the poorest countries, who tend to be, by correlation, in tropical climates where the climate change is adversely likely to be the largest. I think that is reasonably well understood in the developing world, that they are likely to be impacted more, and they are likely to have the least capacity to adapt. So for those of you who know the language of global warming and climate change, mitigation is sort of dealing with the problem of climate change, and adaptation, meaning reducing carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions. And adaptation is sort of, well, it's already happened to us, you know, maybe we should buy an air conditioner, build an irrigation system, build a dike so we're not flooded out, and so on. That's adaptation. And I think it's understood, or starting to be understood in the international community, that if we have climate change very fast, then mitigation isn't going to do much for us, and we're actually going to have a hugely scaled up aid program, or essentially global insurance program for the adversely affected by drought, starvation, and so on. But I want to talk about the other part, which is the mitigation part. So I guess the starting point would be that it's become clear to me that the major developing countries, China and India in particular, by population and growth rate, are under intense pressure essentially to sign up for 50-year time horizon commitments in terms of emissions reductions, or emission targets, not reductions, targets. And they're resisting mightily, and I think for good reason. And I want to argue tonight that this is, you know, sort of bad international relations and bad strategy, probably for everybody, but certainly for the developing countries and sort of flesh that out a little bit. Now, the basic reason this is bad strategy in general is there's a huge amount of uncertainty that will be resolved over time, in part by active research, but in part by just the passage of time and learning things. The part that's best known is the uncertainty about science. As Tom said in his lecture, the range of degrees in terms of climate change for any given level of stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is wide, and it hasn't narrowed very much in the last 20 years of people studying it. I think that's fair. But there's another element that really matters to the developing countries and is less pertinent to us, and that is uncertainty about costs. We have bits and pieces of information about the costs of mitigation, but nothing like systematic knowledge. And that lack of knowledge comes in three categories. One, we actually don't know if we set a global target what it would cost to achieve it. Measure it any way you want, foregone global growth. Second, if somebody asked you, what is the efficient distribution of that mitigation across the globe? We don't know the answer. In a 10-year process, probably we'll create a system that sort of starts to give the answer by providing appropriate incentives. And people have intuitions about that. Some people's intuitions are that rich countries will do more because they have higher emissions. And other people's intuitions are that the poorer, rapidly growing countries will do more because they're kind of dirty. And I could argue that both ways, but the simple truth is we don't know. And the third, and probably the most important dimension of not knowing is not knowing the evolution of those costs in response to an incentive system that changes the technology for dealing with it. Now, under those circumstances, it probably doesn't make much sense for anybody to make a 50-year commitment in terms of emissions reduction unless it's just a way of getting started. But it's absolutely nuts for the developing countries because they don't know what they're signing up for. It could be foregone growth of half of the 10% they're now achieving in the case of China and India, or much less. We just don't know. And there's no particular reason, at least in logic, for trying to answer that question now. I think any system that is developed is going to have to deal with this transition in the imperfect information. It's also going to have to deal with two or three important things. One is efficiency, a subject that in a room full of economists we know pretty well. There are well-known systems that won't get created very fast. Carbon credits, or what are sometimes called cap-and-trade systems, or carbon tax, that will deal with the efficiency question with appropriate monitoring and institutional surround pretty well. The other one's fairness. Now, some people shy away from fairness, but it's not a good idea. We will not be able to deal with this internationally by saying fairness is mushy, and I don't think it's impossible to think about. So let me give you an example and then suggest a couple of things that go along with that. The Human Development Report, which is based on the UN panel for the most part, but takes a distinctly development point of view, has sort of roughly proposed that advanced countries should sort of set a target by 2050 of achieving an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and the developing countries should shoot for 20%. Now, I'm going to try to argue to you that that's flippant and not the right way to go about this. So now I'm going to do numbers, and I apologize if this was the afternoon. There'd be numbers behind me on the screen. China's per capita emissions are about a quarter the United States. And its total emissions are just about the same right now and passing the US. If you apply that formula to China on a 50-year time horizon, if it keeps growing at these rates, it's going to be a pretty wealthy country by then. And so you'd think, well, maybe they should have the same per capita emissions as we do, at least as an entitlement. And sure enough, using that formula, they do. You reduce American emissions by 80%, and China's by 20%, you'll end up with about the same per capita emissions. Now you take India, where the Human Development Report was released in South Asia. India's per capita emissions are 1/20th of the United States. It's poorer, and energy consumption and other things go up. in the course of development, at least for a while. And so if you apply that formula, it turns out in the year 2050, when everybody's agreed, and India's pretty wealthy by that time, doubling every 7 years or so, they'll have a per capita emissions of 1/5 of the United States and 40% of the average in Europe. And they sit back and say, no, this just doesn't make any sense. I mean, I don't mean to kind of pick on the UNDP, but we're simply on the wrong track in terms of how we've gone about kind of thinking about this. And I think there are reasons for it. It's complicated and it's very hard for people to think about, not economists. But the only way people know to kind of go about getting at this is to try to set targets. And what's happening is that the problem seems so big that what's implicitly happening is people are saying, I know fairness is important, but we can't afford it. China and India, for reasons that have to do with data that I'll give you in a minute, people think, or it's just going to blow the lid off the pressure cooker, so nobody says this, to hell with fairness, we can't afford it, because the cost is perceived to be the globe. And I don't think that's right. And the reason it's not right is that when people talk about emissions reduction or mitigation, they almost always, these are lay people now, not economists, not cap and trade or, carbon credit systems or even carbon tax. They implicitly make an assumption, which is the costs of the mitigation will be absorbed in the country in which it's undertaken. Now, there's two variables here, efficiency and fairness. And we just collapsed the two things that we might have imagined were our degrees of freedom, where to do the emissions so as to reduce the cost and who pays for it, into one. And if you do that, then it is probably impossible to find a fair solution to this problem. That is one that they will sign up for. And if they don't sign up for it, then it will get ugly if we stay on this track, because it will spill over with some reasonable probability into things like trade and other things and threats and counter-threats. It's not a good way to go. Finally, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to tell you a little data. I hope you don't fall asleep. Eyes glaze over at dinner. Nobody really knows the safe level of carbon content, emissions, but Tom would say it's, a huge range, factor of 3 from bottom to top. But the UNDP essentially said the global carbon emissions should not exceed about 14.5 gigatons per year in order to be safe. The world is now at 29 gigatons per year. The US is 6 of those, Europe is 4, China is, well, in 2004 it was 5. It's growing so fast it's probably up around 6 or more. It is alleged to be passing the United States as we speak. Russia and company is 1.5, India is 1.3, Japan is 1.3, all of Africa is 1.2, north and south, the entire continent, and Latin America is 1.4. On a per capita basis, the safe level is 2.25 tons per person per year. The United States is at 20.6. So if we were going to line up, we'd go down by 10. Germany, the UK, and Japan, and Europe in general are kind of in the middle. They're at 9.8. They can't just sit there. Italy and Spain are a bit lower, underdeveloped countries. Forgive me, Juliana. China's at 5, and India's at 1. To go back to the aggregates, China and India are at 6.3 gigatons per year, with China being the dominant player. They're both growing at 10%, so they're going to triple their GDPs. And if their carbon intensity, a concept that I wanted to introduce at this point, does not change, then in 25 years, they're approximately 4 trillion GDP will go to 12 trillion, and their carbon emissions will simply balloon. And the world's output relative to what is viewed as the safe level on a per annual basis will be on the order of 3 times the 14.5 gigatons per year. And that is what scares people. The reason I say that is not because that contains a whole lot of reasonable assumptions, but that's what's pushing people to make unreasonable demands and lock up the international negotiations. Now, it isn't that bad. So let me talk about carbon intensity. Just for the sake of this argument, I'm going to measure it as gigatons of carbon per $1 trillion of GDP. These are big countries, so that's a useful way to do it. Japan is 0.19, the EU is 0.29, the Europe is about 0.5, India is 1.3, and China is about 1.7. Okay, so China's carbon footprint measured in how efficiently they generate GDP is huge. And you can see there's a pattern there. I mean, China really is kind of inefficient in this dimension and in energy. But even if you discount for that, you can tell that the carbon intensity goes down as you grow. And the reason for that's fairly simple. We know that growth is structural transformation, and that as economies grow and this structural evolution occurs, they become more knowledge intensive in terms of their, more service intensive in terms of their value-added activities. So it's a perfectly natural phenomenon. It doesn't explain all of these differences, but it's most of them. So it is very likely that that will happen in the case of China and India, notwithstanding their enormous scale and the fact that they have 40% of the world's population. I don't think we have a situation that's out of control. But it's still true that if those forces kick in, the natural tendency is going to be to increase carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. And so if we're not going to impose on them or ask them to agree, to impose on themselves this, what the head of the UN global warming program is saying to them is, we understand your arguments. This is just way too risky for you. Why don't you make a counterproposal? And that's kind of the status quo, where the developing countries really don't know what to say. Not everybody in the developing countries understands the carbon trading systems. Most commentators agree that it will take a long time to create those. And let me pause there. The attraction of a carbon trading system, the attractions are three. One, if it could be put in place, it establishes a price of carbon, and therefore a benchmark for investment in technology with respect to mitigation. The second thing is that it accomplishes, as do carbon taxes, efficient distribution of mitigation across the planet, or at least across the range of entities that are participants. And third, and very importantly, and this really isn't understood in developing countries, the allocation of credits allows you to determine in part who pays for the mitigation. So it gives you that degree of freedom that I said we'd kind of at least implicitly thrown out. So I'll conclude tonight by saying I think this is a very big issue. I think we're kind of in the next year to 2 years leading up to the conclusion of what is supposed to produce the next version of Kyoto are going to either really come apart on this or bring it back together, and it's going to take a lot of useful inputs from economists who understand. I think you can see that what's holding people up now is an inability to think about the economics, you know, and the uncertainty and whatnot of this. So up till now, we've been more worried about what the scientists do and know and responding to it. So we've got clear in our heads that what we're doing is buying what in finance is called tail insurance, meaning something that'll protect us to some extent from the very bottom end of the distribution in terms of adverse outcomes. But now we have this sort of fairness problem with no real discussion of kind of the mechanism for dealing with it, and I think we need to break through it. What are the principles that I think the developing countries could put forward that are alternatives to this rush to make long-term commitments that don't really make sense in the environment that we're in? One is that I think everybody has to subscribe to is the single highest priority is lowering the costs of mitigation. And that means developing technology transfer, creating incentives to do it. The price of carbon would help. And in this, I agree with Tom and everybody else who's thought about it. We need very, very large increases in the subsidies for energy efficiency and carbon mitigation technologies. Second, we are going to need a monitoring entity that is authoritative and thorough and complete. So we might as well get started creating it now. I don't care if it's an existing institution or a new one. And while it's doing that job, it can also do another very important thing, which is take responsibility for the international transfer of technology that is developed. I would say that at least 2/3 of the developing countries in the world can't afford to maintain a global technology monitoring system with respect to anything, let alone global warming. And that would be an added benefit. And if you really wanted to be kind of expansive about it, maybe it could start thinking about how to create the trading markets that are going to go with one or several of these proposals. Third, I think the developing countries should reject the notion that has sometimes been expressed that this is not our problem because we didn't cause it, on two grounds. One, it is their problem. The poorer countries actually have a very big problem. And two, it's not a constructive solution. The fact that it is probably unfair that they have to wrestle with this, not having caused a fair amount of the current stock in the atmosphere, but that's the way it is. Fourth, I think we should have a principle that whatever system is adopted, to the extent possible, it should not impede the growth of developing countries, or as little as possible. And the basis for that is something Tom said in his lecture, and I think it's right, so I'm going to repeat it. The best defense in the medium term against global warming for developing countries is growth, meaning being richer. I think the developing countries have to state clearly that though they're not willing to pay for all the mitigation that occurs on the planet, they need to be part of the system, and at least the major players have to sign up for that. And that means lots of things. It means institutions and monitoring and cooperation and dealing with these trans-border mechanisms that we're going to need to get efficient mitigation done before we have a global trading system. They're called CDM provisions in the Kyoto Protocols. They've been highly criticized because they have improper incentive problems. The CDM provisions basically allow a power plant in Germany that's been told by the EU to clean up to do the job in China or Central America. And the problem is that an entrepreneur, there's a bunch of financial entrepreneurs who are going around saying, okay, we got a deal for you that's going to cost you a whole lot to do it in Germany, but we can plant a forest in a Central American country. And then completely unbeknownst to the EU or the power company, they go to somebody and say, we're going to we're going to plant a forest on this land you have, and we'll cut down another one. You'll be fine. We're going to make a lot of money in this, and there's no net reduction, in carbon emissions. Now, I call those, this is discussed a lot, I call those leaks. My view is we're going to have to live with those leaks. The benefit of trans-border mitigation efforts and getting it started is too great. I think for poorer countries defined to be people who are, up to fairly high middle income levels, the advanced countries are going to need to pay for the mitigation in some system or other. Not all of it, but some of it. And the big challenge is to work out a formula and a system that works. I think the developing countries should just simply reject the target emissions and stick with it, but explain why. It is not a good global strategy. And finally, and then I will sit down and shut up, this astonished me. In a huge range of developing countries, energy is subsidized. I mean, heavily subsidized. In Egypt, in China, a little bit less in India, all over the place. This is one where we can actually move fairly quickly because subsidizing energy is a very bad growth strategy domestically. It's extremely expensive. Its costs are rising with the price of energy, and that money shouldn't be being spent on the subsidies, but should be being spent by governments on education and infrastructure and the other things that are the complementary inputs that drive growth. That will have the salutary effect of producing at least some improvement on the global warming side, but I don't think they have to be convinced to do it for that reason. They just have to be convinced. It is politically very difficult to get out of these energy subsidies, at least in a democratic environment. They're things that people are very attached to. So I'm being a little flip in saying it just should happen, but it is worth undertaking in most environments, a political effort. So that's kind of where I think we are. I think it'll be obvious to you that I don't have any substantive disagreement with anything that Tom has said, either to me personally or in that interview that didn't make it in the Wall Street Journal, or certainly in the lecture. What I think we need is some specific attention to the things that I increasingly detect people in general, but leaders in advanced and developing countries sort of don't understand. So I guess my best hope would be that the next administration in the United States would drop the requirement that they won't make any sort of commitments or plans unless China and India and other people join in. I think it's asymmetric, and that's not right. And I actually wouldn't even encourage the United States to make long-term commitments like that, because it doesn't actually make sense from the point of view of the informational structure of the problem. Thanks very much. I'm taking questions and comments. Mark?
Two questions, so you can choose the easier one to answer. You didn't say anything about time goals. What's the trade-off between a ton of reduction today and a ton of reductions 30 years from now? And does it really make sense to start putting tight limits on when we're not actually at the point where the planet's boiling? The second question is, to what extent should we think, at least in the short term, about albedo increasing measures as a substitute for mitigation?
LBO?
Mount Pinatubo, spraying seeds to get cirrus clouds over the ocean. All things.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay, right. No, well, so on the second, I think we should be serious about that, because it would be great if a feasible technology that's an alternative to reducing carbon emissions, I wouldn't go as far as to say energy consumption for a variety of reasons, is a very good thing. So, you know, I mean, to the extent we need to subsidize investment, that should certainly not be ruled out. And it may be that we tend to get focused on mitigation, which tends to mean either increasing the Earth's takedown rate or reducing the greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, and as is a point that Tom made in his lecture. And there may be a much more efficient way to simply reduce the sort of net warming effect in the Earth. You were talking about shooting things into the very upper atmosphere, weren't you, Tom, in the lecture? So I think that's right. On the question of whether, I mean, you know, the problem is there's stocks and flows, right? And so if you wait too long and you're wrong, and there isn't an alternative technology, then you got a problem. The panel, the UN panel, says on a variety of reasonable protections that we'll go past the safe point in the middle of the century, unless something happens. And the something has to be fairly dramatic in terms of reduced emissions. Now, there's a whole lot of assumptions in that, and I wouldn't want to try to defend it, but I don't think you can argue with respect to tail insurance, if you like, that you have a very surefire strategy that involves waiting. Now, that's different from making long-term commitments that are binding that you don't change, right? So I think the notion is you get on with generating technology you might or might not need, and you get on with sort of learning how to do mitigation in the advanced countries. And, but you can't ignore two entities the size of China and India. And so you have to have a dialogue with them, and you have to sort of start yourself moving toward a path in which they're part of the system on a basis they can understand, and eventually, I mean, it's easy for economists to flip ahead to the global, you know, tradable carbon credit system because it accomplishes all these things. But eventually, they got to be part of that or a similar system. So, because it's very unlikely, notwithstanding what I said before, that all the mitigation is going to occur efficiently in the advanced countries. It's just, it's implausible.
Yes? Just saying, when I think the United States and the relatively taxes on fuels,
Right.
et cetera. But we have $700, $800 billion effective expenditure on the military.
Mm-hmm.
It seems in many ways that that's actually a subsidy to energy, energy prices. Can you speak about the United States' versions of subsidies? We talked about some, like Venezuela is still selling gasoline for the equivalent of something like 5 cents or 10 cents a gallon.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's part of that problem I referred to. I mean, this is, and it's just terrible development strategy. There's no example, of that actually working in terms of accelerating growth or development. It's a political decision because it's popular, and it's unpopular to take it away. I don't know what to say about the American military, but I do think that we are not pricing energy come environment properly yet. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get around to it. And the evidence suggests, again quoted by Tom, that Japan and most of the European countries in the United States have subsidies for energy efficiency research and development that are way below the levels in the 70s and 80s. I guess that probably came up today. So that's kind of hard to justify in this environment because energy efficiency is an important component of it. Whether or not in some accounting system we should account for our access to or security of supply by chalking up the investment in the military to that is, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, it doesn't sound unreasonable. I am very worried, this is a different subject from what I was on, that the incentives are getting larger and larger for a scramble for energy security, meaning a breakdown in what amounts to a global price system for all the obvious reasons. And China, India, and many others are engaging in behavior that looks like that. Now, this may be sort of technically wrong, but it looks a lot like a prisoner's dilemma in terms of incentive structure to me. Yes?
So this morning, when we were talking about international relations, the metaphor that's common in the field is to treat a country like a person, China this and India that. I was also struck this morning that we didn't do that all the time. We said there's several people in the car that may be steering in different directions.
Right.
I think there's probably a fairly wide gap between Hugo Chavez's desire for a war and Venezuela's desire for a war.
That's right.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the ability of the Chinese government to commit the Chinese to anything that's costly at a time when they seem to have been promised a different path. Given that this is a government with a lot of capacity to impose its will, nevertheless, to some degree, it's following popular opinion.
Right. Well, it's a very good question. I would say the Chinese government, as we normally think about it, is still capable of picking a path and living with whatever resistance there are. But the analog of what you're talking about in many other countries actually occurs inside the government in China. And so when they seem, inactive, now this is based a bit on experience. I've spent a lot of time there. Then once you get to know people, they're having a huge argument, and the people you agree with are not winning yet, and sometimes there's inaction, as there is on environmental things. I mean, it's stunning that a country with that environmental problem and that capacity to build the interstate highway system in 12 to 15 years has done so little on the environment. I mean, it's almost impossible to believe until you realize that they have both administrative, because that requires decentralized action, but also, even at the center, real arguments. Why did China sit there, with all that international pressure for so long and hold their exchange rate down? Answer, they didn't run a big trade surplus. That was 3% of GDP up until 2 years ago. It's now 10 or 12, and that's a huge mistake. So why didn't they see it coming? And the answer is, probably you and I know at least 100 people who know that it's a mistake and did see it coming, and they can't get their way. In China, unlike India, that's to me, given the state, the evolving state of their political system, kind of where the real arguments. Once that entity decides to move, there can be bloody protests and riots, as there are, out in the countryside because people are being mistreated, but they can basically, I think, at this stage, move. But, you know, I was going to say, it's just it takes too long. I mean, one of the things that we learned from Tom was to think carefully about these things, and one of the outputs of that was Graham Allison's brilliant book on the essence of decision, in which it was so clear, you know, that what you thought the Soviet Union was going to do in the Cuban Missile Crisis depended on whether you thought the Soviet Union was a person, the military, or some other. I remember reading that book over and over again because I mean, it seems like a simple idea, but it sheds so much light on so many things. Time to quit? Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, it's been a long evening. I'm delighted you could all attend. I want to thank Professor Spence. I very much want to thank Erin King and all the who was superb and certainly corrected almost all of my mistakes today. And everyone else at the Goldman School helped make this, I think, a rather successful day and evening. I very much want to thank Tom and Alice for being with us, and good evening.